councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist.
In this speech, made at the end of his presidency, Eisenhower gave this warning as the power of the military-industrial complex had eclipsed that of the presidency itself. Against Eisenhower's express orders, the CIA, on behalf of the military-industrial complex, sent Francis Gary Powers on his 1st of May 1960 U-2 flight over the Soviet Union. This was done to actively frustrate President Eisenhower's attempt to end the Cold War by a detente with Nikita Khrushchev. By ensuring the Cold War continued, the military-industrial complex wrested executive control from the presidency, cementing its place as the locus of real power in America. The U.S. Military Officer Corps numbered 25,500 in 1938. It rose to a peak of almost 1 million by the end of World War II and fell only to 415,000 in 1946, or 16 times its pre-war size. Clearly the power and the glory, not to mention the continued employment, was not to be easily let go of, and they never looked back. Post-World War I, along with others, prominent Republican senator and isolationist William E. Borah was highly critical of the extent of war profits and their cost to the economy, which in 1918 was 21% of GDP for direct war expenditure alone. This constraint curtailed militarism and military spending in the interwar years. This was not to be so post-World War II. Despite direct war expenditure reaching 41% of GDP at its peak in 1944, this money spout and the entire debt model, which continues to the present, was never relinquished. Despite the attempts of Eisenhower and others, post the initial demobilization, the military and the profits of militarism marched together from height to height. The reason given for this is the communist threat and the Cold War. But the dates don't line up. US military expenditure increased nearly 100%. $3 billion was for 1948's military component of the Marshall Plan, which in Keenan's own words was deliberately structured to
force the Russians either to reject the plan or to accept it on terms which would be destructive of their own system.
$300 million of the 1948 spend was to crush the Greek partisans, whose struggle Stalin did nothing to assist, saying something like, "The Greeks are not worth a single Soviet soldier." Another $100 million was spent buying favour with Turkey. Intermediate-range ballistic missiles, placed in Turkey, were the proximate cause of the Cuban Missile Crisis. This is how the military-industrial complex worked. The military created threats, industry grew fat countering them, and senior officers retired to sinecures on company boards and think tanks. Expenditure further increased by another 38% in 1949. A major US military expenditure was the Marshall Plan, which aimed to destabilize the Soviet zone in Europe with American largesse. This precipitated the Berlin crisis, as the workers' paradise was no match for the mighty dollar. Facing the loss of the skilled workforce of Eastern Europe and being left with an economy of old people and children, the war was the only option the Soviets had. The Berlin crisis was an admission of economic defeat. Churchill's Iron Curtain speech was rewriting history. No one expected Stalin to allow free elections in Eastern Europe. Despite the fine prose of the Yalta Agreement, the post-war settlement was a victor's peace, and the spoils were distributed by right of conquest, as the Americans freezing out of the Soviet Union from any involvement in post-war Japan demonstrates, but he did hold up his end of the bargain and never lifted a finger to block the spoils of the West, such as Greece. As commander of Allied forces in World War II, Eisenhower had witnessed Hiroshima's aftermath, and as the Army Chief of Staff, he considered nuclear weapons unusable in future wars. When president of Columbia University, he wrote privately, "Atomic war is suicide." Eisenhower advised Truman against General MacArthur's 1951 plan for escalation of the Korean War by dropping 30 to 50 nuclear bombs in Manchuria on Chinese troop concentration supply lines and airfields north of the Yalu River. In his diary in February 1951, Eisenhower wrote, "MacArthur's plan would lead to global war." In April 1951, Truman subsequently rejected MacArthur's plan on the basis that this would mean all-out war with China and probably Russia. MacArthur also proposed using Cobalt-60 bombs to create an uninhabitable buffer zone between Korea and China. Eisenhower wrote that MacArthur's Cobalt plan is genocidal madness. Eisenhower's five-star status was reactivated for him to lead NATO forces as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe, and in this capacity provided military advice to Truman. This involvement meant that when Eisenhower became president, he was very familiar with the current strategic situation. Moreover, as a fiscal Republican, he was also very aware of the cost of the Cold War. Truman had fired MacArthur over his advocacy of nuclear war. Subsequently, the leader of the war party was Curtis "Bombs Away" LeMay, head of the Strategic Air Command. At an Inter-Services Strategic Air Command briefing on 18 March 1954, General LeMay was asked, "What would you advocate in case hostilities are renewed in Korea?" LeMay answered,
"There are no suitable strategic air targets in Korea. However, I would drop a few bombs in proper places in China, Manchuria, and southeastern Russia. In those poker games, such as Korea and Indochina, we have never raised the ante. We have always just called the bet. We ought to try raising sometime."
In advocating dropping nuclear bombs on the USSR itself, LeMay was taking a far more extreme position than even MacArthur, who only advocated dropping nukes on Soviet forces in Manchuria. Shortly after his inauguration, at the April 1953 National Security Council meeting, Eisenhower put LeMay in his place, saying, "We're not going to nuke China and drag the Soviets in. That's how world wars start." Eisenhower silenced LeMay's opposition, saying, "General, I fought real wars. Your job is to deter them. And generals think only in terms of bombs. We're not destroying cities to win a war." LeMay's continued adherence to population war is set out in his 1956 SAC Atomic Weapons Requirements Study, which listed a total of 120 cities for annihilation, including East Berlin. Notably, LeMay set out this plan despite the president's clear opposition to a first strike.
I have heard this thought stated many times and it sounds very fine. However, it is not in keeping with United States history. Just look back and note who started the Revolutionary War, the War of 1812, the Indian Wars, and the Spanish-American War. I want to make it clear that I am not advocating a preventive war. However, I believe that if the U.S. is pushed in the corner far enough, we would not hesitate to strike first.
Eisenhower responded by cutting SAC's budget. But the president soon had a problem with the bomber gap.
Mr. President, we must not allow a mine shaft gap.
At the 1954 May Day parade,
What impressed foreign observers most was Russia's new four-jet swept-wing bomber, presumably capable of long-distance H-bomb attack.
As they had very few of these, they flew them over Red Square multiple times to create the illusion of having more. The Soviet May Day parade was always attended by senior NATO Air Force officers. These highly experienced airmen knew that the Soviets were playing catch-up and must have noticed that few bisons were visible at any one time. They would have also seen that the gap between the flights was big enough for the planes to be flying in a circle, but no one was letting on. NATO analysts counted the bisons at 60, extrapolated this to a potential 600 in short order, and the bomber gap was born. Only 125 bisons were ever built over its 10-year production run from 1953 to 1963. Even taking the wildly inflated figure of 600, added to the Soviet fleet of knockoff B-29s, this only makes a top-end number of around 11 to 1,200 planes, but with ranges of only around 5,500 kilometres, they were on a one-way trip to continental America. In contrast, in 1954, the US had around 2,000 strategic bombers of all sorts. While only the 400 B-36s were transcontinental, the US had bases in Europe and air refuelling. The bomber gap was always phony. Eisenhower had his suspicions that the bomber gap was a myth, and this is what birthed the U-2 program. With his military staying mum and Democrat senators from states with Air Force contracts baying at his heels, Eisenhower needed proof. Overflights showed that the Soviets had very few bisons and that numbers were only slowly increasing. By 1959, official circles recognized that the bomber gap didn't exist. However, as the public was in full-scale panic mode, most didn't notice that the bomber gap morphed into the missile gap. The missile gap had some foundation in Sputnik. Leading the charge was JFK, who coined the term, despite being privy to Senate CIA briefings which contradicted there being any missile gap. The origin of the missile gap theory surfaces at a presidential conference at which CIA Director Alan Dulles was relying on a wild-eyed UK briefing to Prime Minister Harold Macmillan to spook Eisenhower, although wiser heads prevailed. The missile gap was a central plank of JFK's 1960 presidential campaign. JFK was pushing for $440 billion, $2025, of military expenditure in financial year 1961. U-2 flights, including a December 1959 mission, confirmed limited Soviet missile deployments. By January 7, 1960, Alan Dulles reported that the Soviets only had 50 operational ICBMs. Later Corona satellite imagery revealed only 10 to 25 Soviet ICBM launches. Like the bomber gap, the missile gap was always phony. Leaving aside the huge American advantage in bombers, especially with the B-52 being produced since 1955. By 1960, the US had 60 Atlas ICBMs, together with 30 Jupiter IRBMs in Italy and another 15 in Turkey. In November 1960, the USS George Washington, the first nuclear-powered and nuclear-armed submarine, began its first operational patrol with 16 Polaris A-1 missiles. Fully aware of the danger and cost of the Cold War, in 1955, Eisenhower had pushed for an open skies initiative. This had been rejected by the Soviets, probably as it would have shown that their cupboard was bare, but diplomatic feelers continued. Nikita Khrushchev was a survivor. Not only physically, his memoirs note that almost everyone who worked with him was arrested, but also morally. Although he once said that he was up to his armpits in blood, probably referring to his tenure in the Ukraine, one of his first acts as premier was to release tens of thousands of Ukrainians imprisoned in the gulags after the liberation of the Ukraine during World War II. In stepping back from the abyss of Bolshevik terror, Nikita Khrushchev became one of the great men of his time if not of history. What greatly aided him in this was that he didn't look the part. Among the post-Stalin 10-man Soviet presidium, the New York Times listed Malenkov and Beria first and second, with Khrushchev last. Short and dumpy, with a face that could be comical, almost clownish. In the last lap, he outclassed the intellectual Malenkov and outfoxed the feral Beria. He sidelined the veteran Molotov, left his old boss Kaganovich in the dust, and even outmaneuvered the great General Zhukov. As Premier of the USSR, Khrushchev had two great concerns. He saw the deep structural flaws in the Soviet system and knew that the economy could not sustain its military costs of 25% of GDP. His other great concern was nuclear war. Stalin's second great misstep of walking into the Korean War trap that the Americans had set for him placed the USSR on a collision course with the West, and Khrushchev worried that nuclear war was civilizational suicide. To these ends he sought a detente with the US, leading to the Cultural Agreement of 1958 and Vice President Nixon opening an American National Exhibition in Moscow in July 1959.
Moscow, the heart of world communism, yesterday became, for a day, the headquarters of an unprecedented and startling international debate, featuring on the one hand Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, the irrepressible and outspoken leader of communism. On the other, the Vice President of the United States, Richard Nixon, cast in the role of defender of capitalism and American foreign policy. Mr. Nixon, as you know, arrived in Moscow this week to open the American exhibition there. He paid a courtesy call on Premier Khrushchev yesterday at the Kremlin. After exchanging greetings and pleasantries, the two began trading verbal brickbats in a heated discussion on Cold War issues. Part of the unscheduled fireworks was recorded on videotape while they toured the television studio at the American exhibition. The tape was flown to New York by a representative of the Ampex Corporation, videotape equipment manufacturers. And here now is that videotape recording of one of the most unusual foreign policy debates shortly after it got underway.
Мы с американцами только хотим жить в мире и в дружбе, потому что мы самые могущественные государства, и если мы будем дружить, то будут дружить и другие страны. А если найдется какой-нибудь очень воинственный, можем немножко за ушко его дернуть и сказать: не смей.
We only want to live with Americans in peace and friendship because we ourselves are a powerful country and we will be friendly with each other. Other countries will be friendly too. And if anybody comes in a fighting mood, we could pull his ear ever so little and tell him, don't dare, wars are not allowed now. This is a time of atomic weapons. Any fool could start a war, but no person in his right mind would want the war to continue. And consequently, that's how we guide ourselves in our...
On leaving Moscow, Nixon went on a tour of the USSR. This included a visit to Sverdlovsk, a closed military city. During the visit, one of the entourage photographed a S-75 mobile surface-to-air missile system. The Soviets requested the film, but this was denied, Nixon claiming diplomatic immunity. As it is highly unlikely the Soviets allowed Nixon to visit a closed city and then just left a S-75 lying about, it must be assumed that they wanted to warn the US that the S-75 had been deployed. That the US arrogantly ignored this warning added to the insult of violating Soviet airspace on its most sacred day. After Nixon's return, Eisenhower publicly invited Khrushchev to tour the US. This was supposed to go through diplomatic channels, but within 48 hours, Khrushchev agreed, bypassing usual protocols. Although the New York Times had badly misjudged Khrushchev in 1954, few did in 1959. The visit was to culminate in a Camp David meeting with Eisenhower, and so to soften him up, Khrushchev was to be shown the might of America on a grueling schedule. Khrushchev also planned some flexing. He was to fly to the US on the Tu-114, the only aircraft in the world then capable of flying non-stop from Moscow to the US. and the pride of Soviet aeronautics. However, Soviet engineers found some cracks in the engines, and Khrushchev was informed that he would have to take another plane, which would make a series of landings. Khrushchev refused. This meeting was so important to Khrushchev that he, his wife and son, not to mention many high-level Soviet functionaries and the crew, flew non-stop over the Atlantic on a plane with engine problems. After a formal state welcome, Khrushchev drove in a motorcade through Washington, during which a surreal scene unfolded. The streets were lined with onlookers, but they just stood there, in sullen silence. Unperturbed, Khrushchev smiled and continually waved his hat to the crowd. At the Oval Office, Khrushchev presented Eisenhower with a model replica of the pennant carried by the Soviet Luna 2 spacecraft, which the day before had become the first man-made object to reach the moon. The timing could not have been coincidental. Moreover, Khrushchev's manner is revealing. We see Khrushchev acting like an adolescent who has managed to prank a teenager. It is bragging, but the light-heartedness of the jest cannot be missed.
Again, he's waving to the crowds, and he's done this all through his tour of Washington, apparently completely oblivious or uncaring about the fact that very few people in the crowds here have waved back or done anything but stare at him rather stonily. This does not prevent the chairman from waving heartily and smiling, a rather broad, engaging grin, I must confess.
In a nation of shows, Khrushchev's showmanship did not pass unnoticed.
We'll be covering the Khrushchev visit, of course, this morning, as we did yesterday, and will all this week. We'll be showing you perhaps facets of him that you may not have recognized, like what a great showman he turned out to be yesterday.
Yes, I knew when that little girl presented him with the flowers that he was going to embrace her or pat her head or something.
Little things like taking the play away from the president by holding his Homburg up a couple feet in the air to shade his face.
Things that actors kill other actors for.
Yes.
The way he took out those little 18th century glasses of his, little round glasses, slowly put them on his face, that was brilliant.
Putting his arm around the president in the car riding into the airport, winking at the reporters.
Tight squeeze, that was, wasn't it?
Yes, there was not very much space left there in that back seat between Mr. and Mrs. K and the president.
They talk about Americans being overfed. I think the Russians do all right.
The president was almost lost in the back seat there. You could barely see him.
His two-day visit to New York over, Chairman Khrushchev flies 3,000 miles across the United States to Los Angeles.
At a televised lunch with the Hollywood stars, Khrushchev gave one of his great performances and opened his first salvo on the confines of his official tour. Khrushchev's Disney World complaint was masterful political theatre, but then opportunity came Khrushchev's way on a plate, handed to him by the LA mayor. That evening in his hotel rooms, Khrushchev complained loudly to his entourage about his treatment, saying he was going to call it all off and go home. But he also grinned and pointed to the ceiling where he imagined the microphones were.
Washington, where or near where the climax of Khrushchev's trip will be played in a few days, has watched the Soviet leader's tour past the halfway mark with mixed feelings. There is, as the White House statement said today, a profound wish that Khrushchev will be treated courteously on his tour. It would be a shame if relations between the giant nuclear nations which survived the Berlin blockade and the Korean War should now founder on a missed excursion to the Disneyland amusement park. Washington wants nothing to happen which would cast a shadow on the talks Khrushchev is to have with President Eisenhower here late this week.
The White House statement was probably formulated after a meeting of Eisenhower and Nixon, in which the latter advised managing Khrushchev's visit like a political campaign, as what followed certainly had that flavour. At last Mr. K could work the crowds.
I am impressed by the number of people waiting to see the Soviet premier. Nikita Khrushchev is at the heart of the matter tonight in Des Moines, Iowa, where he's the biggest attraction since the Iowa State Fair closed about 2 weeks ago. Well, tomorrow, Mr. Khrushchev goes to the Garst farm, the real object of his visit to Iowa. He had said all along that he hoped to visit his old friend Roswell Garst at Coon Rapids.
There was like a whole army of media at the Garst farm that day. When Garst started showing me around, this horde of journalists, photographers and cameramen literally started running around us in circles. Pretty soon, Garst started to get furious, and he had a perfectly good reason for it. These journalists were trampling his crops. They were worse than locusts. By the time when one American journalist appeared right in front of us, he probably just wanted to take a good picture or something. Garst was already boiling with rage. And so he went and kicked that journalist in the ass. And I must say, left a pretty good footprint on the journalist's backside.
From Pittsburgh, Mr. Khrushchev flies back to Washington. He returns to the capital city from which his American journey began. Behind him are busy days of traveling and constantly meeting people. Ahead are a few days of private conversations with President Eisenhower.
During our talks at Camp David, Eisenhower would repeatedly tell me, "Mr. Khrushchev, I really want to come to an agreement with you on these burning issues." I would answer him, "Mr. President, it would make me very happy as well." But at the same time I knew, how could we come to an agreement? The positions of our two countries at the time stood in such extreme opposition to each other. The conditions simply weren't ripe yet for us to come to an agreement on pretty much anything. And to be perfectly frank, I never had any illusions that I would come to America, would have a talk, and all of the world's problems would magically disappear. What kind of a daydream is that? Moscow wasn't built in a day, you know? These things take time, and you have to start small. We came to the USA to see and to be seen, and that's exactly what we did.
Back in the USSR, the mood had also changed. The Soviet press had been unusually open about Khrushchev's trip, and it seemed that the Cold War was coming to an end. As early as the late 1940s, the Soviets realized that their fighter aircraft would find intercepting the high-flying US B-50 and B-36 bombers severely challenging. With the US ahead in bomber development, the Soviets looked to surface-to-air missiles as an air defense weapon, resulting in the 1950 launch of the System 25, which became operational in 1955. The overlap between CIA estimates of S-25 positions and their actual positions shows why the next generation surface-to-air missile, the S-75, was mobile. In June 1956, Western Air Force delegations had been invited to a Soviet military air show at Tushkino Airfield in the Moscow area. The US team was headed by the Air Force's Chief of Staff, General Twining. At a reception, Khrushchev launched into protracted toasts in defense of peace. In the midst of this, he turned to General Twining and said, "Today we showed you our aircraft, but would you like to have a look at our missiles?" "Yes," the general responded. "Well, we will not show them to you," replied Khrushchev. "First, show us your aircraft and stop sending intruders into our airspace. We will shoot down uninvited guests. We will get all of your Canberras. They are flying coffins." The British Canberra bomber was also built under license in the US and modified as the RB-57 long-range reconnaissance aircraft. With a service ceiling of 66,000 feet, it flew above the reach of the S-25, but not the S-75. Perhaps because of this warning, a switch was made to U-2s, and on the 4th of July 1956, a U-2 detachment from Wiesbaden in Germany made 5 deep incursions into Soviet airspace. As General Twining would have authorized this operation, it appears that this was his response to Khrushchev's request to show us your aircraft. The first S-75 batteries were deployed in the Soviet Union in late 1957. With a missile able to reach 82,000 feet in altitude, it was quite capable of reaching the U-2's 71,000 foot operational ceiling over the Soviet Union. On 7 October 1959, a Chinese S-75 shot down a US Canberra at 66,000 feet over China, scoring the first destruction of an enemy aircraft by a surface-to-air missile. Eisenhower had used the U-2 overflights to debunk the bomber gap, but Allen Dulles wanted more U-2 overflights on the basis that there was a critical need for Soviet ICBM information. However, the CIA claim that the Soviet missile program was an existential threat was a fallacy contradicted by its own 1955 National Intelligence Estimate, which stated that the USSR did not have the resources, and particularly the electronics requirements, for a large missile program. As early as 16 December 1958, Eisenhower was concerned that as U-2 flights were being tracked by the Soviets, it was questionable that the information received was worth exacerbating relations with them. This was especially so as the flights did not solve the problem of detection of surprise attack. He also thought that the U-2 should be generally available for the Air Force rather than being only a CIA SAC asset, which would have not been received well by Dulles. A constant theme in Eisenhower's presidential memos of the time is the president being mostly alone in making the cost-benefit analysis of the U-2 flights and appreciating the danger of not reaching a detente with the USSR. For example, on April 7, 1959, Eisenhower cancelled prior approval of flights on the basis that straws in the wind indicated that progress in detente was not wholly hopeless. One of the few declassified CIA U-2 documents is a briefing paper from 31 March 1959. The first part of this document addresses U-2 vulnerability tests, but deals only with fighter threats to the U-2 and makes no reference to the U-2's vulnerability to surface-to-air missiles. The second part of this briefing paper is advocacy for the flight and refers to Soviet missiles being a major threat and of the critical need for intelligence collection. The third part set out targets together with weather forecasts and provides maps for the proposed flights. There appears to be no declassified U-2 vulnerability report or any other briefing paper for the 1960 Mayday flight. There is only this presidential record. This record shows that against his better judgment, Eisenhower had agreed to another flight. It seems sometime in late April or May 1960. But he clearly ordered that this was not to be on May Day. As Dulles directly disobeyed this order, it is an open question as to whether there were any other irregularities. In the presidential memo of 7 April 1959, Eisenhower was concerned about the terrible propaganda impact that would be occasioned if a reconnaissance plane were to fail. Was Eisenhower aware that the Powers flight would go over the S-75 battery photographed during Nixon's visit to Sverdlovsk? Plainly Dulles was, and deliberately risked power's life to promote the Cold War agenda. Throughout the declassified documents reviewed, there is a complete avoidance of the threat the S-75 posed to the U-2. The missile threat was generally discussed at the Presidential Conference of 3 April, but Soviet surface-to-air missiles were agreed to not be comparable to US surface-to-air missiles, a conclusion directly at odds with the missile gap theory. In reality, the 1955 S-25's V-300 missiles' 65,000-foot flight ceiling bested the Nike's 60,000-foot, and the 1957 S-75 V-750's 82,000-foot ceiling bested the Ajax 75,000-foot ceiling. The Hercules was a nuclear weapon designed for area defense. Missile experts commonly gauge the range of missiles from their dimensions, and both missiles have been publicly displayed. As stated in the 3 April memo, if the Soviet systems were comparable to the US surface-to-air missiles, the U-2 would not be able to perform its mission. With its effective operational altitude of 71,000 feet on missions over the USSR and its inability to take evasive action, the U-2 was highly vulnerable to the S-75, and the CIA was deceiving the President that it was not. Both the Canberra and the U-2 were equipped with electronic surveillance equipment from which the radio envelopes of the S-25 and S-75 radars could be gauged. CIA sources claim that electronic intelligence was a secondary objective, but ELINT maps air defense systems, and air defense defeat was a primary objective for any attack on the USSR or retaliatory strike. Electronic intelligence gathered by the U-2 remains almost completely classified, despite 1950s technology and techniques having no current military value. While this could be said to be a result of the primacy of the military-industrial complex within American society, it also serves to hide the CIA coup against President Eisenhower. It seems that Dulles' plan was for Powers to be either shot down by the Sverdlovsk S-75 and killed, or, if the U-2 was just damaged, Powers was counted on to blow up the surveillance gear and commit suicide with his poisoned dart. If Powers had made it all the way through to Finland, and his was the first and last flight to attempt a complete traverse of the USSR, Khrushchev could have decided to hush it up. But a dead airman and a shot-down plane on Soviet soil was of a different order, especially as the US cover story was that a NASA weather plane had gone missing. As related by Colonel Orlov of the Moscow Air Defense Command, hours before the beginning of the annual May Day parade, Soviet air defense forces detected a high-altitude target flying over Tajik in Central Asia. As members of the command element of the air defences arrived and went to their workstations, an uncomfortable situation was shaping up. The May Day parade was scheduled to get underway at mid-morning, and leaders of the party, the government and the armed forces were to be present as usual. In other words, at a time when a major parade linked to Soviet military prowess was about to begin, a not yet identified foreign aircraft was flying over the heart of the country, and Soviet air defences appeared unable to shoot it down. The aircraft thus was tracked from the ground in a tense atmosphere. Khrushchev demanded that the intruding aircraft be shot down at all costs. The U-2 then entered the engagement zone of a S-75 battery near Sverdlovsk. The unit's officer in charge issued the order, destroy target. At 0853 hours, The battalion's first missile exploded behind the U-2, its fragments piercing the tail section and the wings. Powers bailed out and was captured. Surprisingly, parts of the U-2 also survived. Khrushchev, ever the cagey strategist, kept mum. The Eisenhower Library has a single page which is referenced to May 1960 and is titled Cover Plan to be Used for Down U-2 Flight. The document itself bears no date, neither does it bear any names. The story was that a U-2 was on a weather mission out of Adana, Turkey. It had reported oxygen difficulties over emergency frequencies, and a search effort was underway in the Lake Van area. By 5th of May, the weather mission had become a NASA research airplane when the highly secretive U-2s were only operated by the CIA. Also on the 5th of May, Senator Mike Mansfield of Montana stated, "First reports indicate that the President had no knowledge of the plane incident. If that is the case, we have got to ask whether or not this administration has any real control over the federal bureaucracy." Mansfield was the majority whip and a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. In 1956, he had criticized the CIA for failing to provide any forewarning of the Suez Crisis or the Hungarian uprising, and had moved a resolution to create a joint intelligence committee within the Senate Rules Committee. These actions made him the most vocal critic of the CIA in the Senate at the time. The memorandum for the record, dated April 25, 1960, is written by A.J. Goodpaster and states that the message was conveyed to Mr. Bissell. Bissell was Deputy Director for Plans and a Dulles protege in regard to clandestine operations. He ran the U-2 project and the Bay of Pigs op, hawking the plant with Dulles when the latter failed spectacularly. While it cannot be known who else was told of the memo, this could only have been a very small group of people. On the face of it, this presidential directive was only known to Bissell, Dulles, Goodpaster, and Eisenhower. Plainly neither Bissell nor Dulles would have leaked this. Goodpaster was Eisenhower's staff secretary and a highly decorated army officer. He was often described as Eisenhower's right-hand man on national security issues. Given the complete trust Eisenhower placed in Goodpaster, it is almost inconceivable that Goodpaster would have leaked to Mansfield without Eisenhower's asking him to. It cannot be known who else was informed of this memo. The most likely source of the leak was Eisenhower himself. Having given the Americans enough rope to hang themselves, on 7 May, Khrushchev trotted out Powers and then put surprisingly intact parts of the U-2 on public display. The US State Department responded the same day, referring to a missing unarmed U-2, and stated that its flight was unauthorized. On 9 May, Khrushchev told the US ambassador Tommy Thompson that he could not help but suspect that someone had launched this operation with the deliberate intent of spoiling the summit meeting. This was conveyed to Eisenhower by cable, Thompson also saying that Khrushchev suspected it was Allen Dulles, and that Khrushchev had heard about Senator Mansfield's remarks that Eisenhower did not control his own administration. Upon receiving this cable, Eisenhower, who frequently was very animated, was quiet and depressed. The only words he said to his secretary were, "I would like to resign." But Eisenhower was an old soldier who couldn't resign. He was faced with an incredibly difficult choice. Telling the American public that the CIA had gone rogue might save the prospect of detente, but it would unleash a political firestorm with elections in November. If his administration had lost control of the CIA, as Mansfield, a Democrat senator, claimed, this could have destroyed Richard Nixon's presidential hopes in a tight race. Eisenhower had approved previous flights, and the general public might not appreciate how particularly damaging the Mayday flight was. America was in the grip of a great fear of nuclear annihilation and Senator McCarthy's Reds Under the Bed campaign. Eisenhower had a meeting with Dulles, of which there is no record. On 9 May, Secretary of State Herter responded to Khrushchev with a lengthy denunciation of Soviet foreign policy. It referred to the alleged shooting down of an unarmed American civilian aircraft, apparently forgetting that 4 days before it had been part of a NASA weather research program. In conflict with the 7 May statement, rather than the flight being unauthorized, it was now claimed that such flights were not subject to presidential authorization. Around May 10, Dulles gave congressional leaders a briefing on the U-2 program. Either later that day or on the next day, Clarence Cannon, chair of the House Appropriations Committee, gave a speech to an open session of the House of Representatives, stating, Cannon's selection for this role is curious. Although the Appropriations Committee is one of the great powers of Congress, foreign relations are not part of its brief. Moreover, after his speech, Democrats and Republicans uncharacteristically rose to their feet to applaud in what might be the first expression of uniparty cohesion. Cannon's reference to the direction and control of the CIA, only acting under the aegis of the Commander-in-Chief, left Mansfield's claim unresolved. At a press conference on 11 May, Eisenhower untruthfully reiterated the line taken by the State Department that he had issued broad directives with operations supervised by responsible officials within this area of secret activities, when truthfully, all U-2 flights over the Soviet Union were approved and unapproved by President Eisenhower. At the Paris Peace Conference, Khrushchev demanded an apology for the U-2 flight. Eisenhower refused. Khrushchev walked out and unilaterally cancelled Eisenhower's trip to Russia. It was the end of detente. Khrushchev had publicly advocated for a policy of peaceful coexistence with the United States. The May Day celebrations on 1 May 1960 were absent the militarized symbols of previous parades. Instead, there were children, white doves, and athletes. Now Khrushchev had to answer to his hardliners and the Soviet military-industrial complex. According to Walter Cronkite, Khrushchev would go on to say that the U-2 incident was the beginning of his decline in power as party chairman. He had backed peace with a nation which was in the hands of a military-industrial complex which wanted endless military expansion. Eisenhower was a great general who knew how to pick his battles. He had served one way or another his whole adult life and would die in 1969. He gave his warning and passed the baton to a younger man, although he could never have thought what this would cost the latter. The military-industrial complex had won. Detente was over, and the Cold War money machine went from strength to strength, eventually creating the security state, which is founded on the fear of annihilation. It also ruined Eisenhower's attempt to instill fiscal responsibility, continuing the drift towards military Keynesianism.